Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 5th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of June 28th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited being that now we are moved into quote-unquote the summer season for the Northern Hemisphere. Southern Hemisphere, you guys would be moving into your winter season. We're having the solstice kind of happening here. This transition now that the Southern Hemisphere is going to start slowly getting more light. Northern Hemisphere, we're going to be slowly losing light. But in this transition, in this movement, there's also a lot of things that are still happening. Like by me, one of the things as we are moving into the summer season, even as we're losing sunlight, it's this recognition then on how things are moving into bloom. We're recognizing things changing. We're recognizing growth that's starting to happen. And as we've kind of been reiterating the last few weeks, we are in this season after Pentecost. We are in this growth season. We are in this time where we need to be growing. This is our growth period of time. And I know it's difficult. I know it's hard. I know there's a million other things we should be doing at times it feels. But it's also, as we kind of get into the text this week, I feel this kind of gets reiterated yet again. In doing that, in making that time for God, things will be easier. Things will get smoother. Things will get done and probably more efficiently. But sometimes we have to quit relying on our own understanding for us to have these things happen. And that's one of the things that sometimes is difficult. So before we jump into for this week, let's look back to last week's question, which was, where do you need more reflection? And I think this is a hard question. It isn't necessarily an easy question, but it's a question that we all need to be going through at different phases of our lives and fairly consistently. The recognition of what are we striving for? What are we going toward? And I know one of the answers that we got this week was talking about how I have had these different abilities, but I'm also recognizing how those abilities at times is taking away from me being able to do things with other people. And I think that's one of the things that's a hard balance. I know it's one of the things that I wrestle with at times with this podcast is trying to make sure that I'm doing this, but also still balancing family time with that as well. And still trying to make sure that other aspects of my life are balanced. That aspect of trying to balance means we need to be having these types of deep reflection questions. And what are things that we need to be scooping up? And what are things that we need to be letting go of? Those types of questions can sometimes be very difficult, very hard, very contemplative for us to be working on, thinking through, and dealing with as we continue to move along within our faith journey. And I think it's one of these questions that we need to keep coming back to in order for us to really get to the heart of it, is through self-reflection, is through continuing to ask those questions that sometimes are not the questions that we want to be getting into. The hard questions are often the questions we need to be confronting ourselves. So let's just jump into it this week. One of the Old Testament texts we can have continues in Genesis chapter 22, the first 14 verses of it. Now, remember, as we've kind of been walking through this section here of Genesis, we have had where the promise where we're going to get Isaac. We also then have where Sarah is jealous of having Ishmael and his mother still in their group and kind of kicking them out and God continuing to provide for them. Now we kind of get this on the other side of it where Abraham is being told to go and take your son, take a couple people, and you're going to go and make an offering. And they get to a place where Abraham is told, leave the other people behind, just take your son, we're going to go and build this altar. They're bringing the wood. The son even asks, what are we going to present as the burnt offering? And Abraham says, God will provide, to the point where they have put the wood on, they are getting ready to kill his son, Abraham is, and an angel of the Lord comes to him and says, okay, we see what you're doing. Do not lay a hand on him. Look over there. There's a ram that you can use for your sacrifice. This recognition on how, one, through listening to what God has been telling Abraham to do and continuing to reiterate that, we then are able to see that God does continue to provide for Abraham in this sense. The psalm then that goes with that then is Psalm 13, all 6 verses of it. And this recognition and longing that we have over the separation at times that we feel between us and God. And in doing that, we're looking for ways to recognize and see God, but then also knowing that steadfast love that God has for us and continuing to lay into that, continue to trust in that, and realizing that will bring us joy. That is going to bring forth the song that God is calling us to do. In the semi-continuous text this week, then we are in Jeremiah again, chapter 28, verses 5 to 8. And this is, again, this recognition on, as a prophet, that we are continuing to steer after what God is steering us toward, and recognizing that the words that we are prophesying, the words that we are saying, are words that are coming from God, that this is stuff that we are listening to and obeying. And the prophets that have come before continue in that way. It's the aspect of that we're following what the Lord has said, not necessarily what is the convenient thing for them to say. It's recognizing that this is what God says for us and laying into that and continuing to do that even when it is hard. The psalm that goes with that then is Psalm 89, the first 4 verses of it, and then 15 through 18. This dives a little bit more into the steadfast love of God has for us. This recognition on how God is faithful to us, God does love us, God has made these covenants with us, and that God will continue to take care of us generation after generation after generation. And then as we continue to live into that, as we continue to do that, the results are, happy are the people who have done this. They exalt in the name of the Lord. They recognize the glory and strength of what God has done, and they are acknowledging God in what God has done in the whole church, the whole body of God because of that. The epistle text or second reading this week then is out of Romans chapter 6, starting at verse 12 to 23. This then continues on this idea of if we are bonded to sin, it means that as we are also bonded to Christ, we do not continue to be in that same way. We let go of that. We recognize that, yes, we are under the law, but it is by grace that we continue to then strive for where we're needing to go. It's this recognition on within ourselves that we must continue to move forward in order for us to be successful. And in order for us to be able to do that and be successful, we need to continue to recognize the grace of what God has done for us in letting go of these sins, and recognizing that that doesn't give us a reason to just keep sinning. It's a reason for us to continue to strive to do better and continue on the path on where God is steering us, instead of just saying, well, God will forgive me type of mentality. The gospel text then this week is out of Matthew chapter 10, starting in verse 40 to 42. Let's just read this. It's such a short reading. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive a reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. This recognition on how we are then called to continue to go out and to serve. We are welcoming, we are caring, we are acknowledging that God is going to continue to provide, but then we need to also do something with what we have been provided. It's not something for us to be fully hoarding, it's for something for us to be sharing as well. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we'll do a shameless plug. Whoa! Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, having great commentaries, having great podcasts on their own, along with great conversations, thinking about preaching, thinking about how do we look at these texts and talk about these texts and relate to these texts. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, along with having prayers, hymns, colors, daily readings to help you get into these texts week after week, day after day, but along with also having their art. And as we've been talking about, they have their liturgical art section that is going through a soft launch. They're looking for feedback, and it's been an amazing resource that I've utilized multiple times over, looking at how different people throughout the world, throughout time, have interpreted these texts through artistic vision can be extremely helpful. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies for the weekly lectionary, similar to this, along with then having a newsletter going through the Green Blade Rising publication, which goes through more event notifications, but also some different resources that also might be extremely helpful. I really enjoy this stuff. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I know you're going to enjoy the resources over there. That'll be the first link down in the show notes, and make sure to check that out. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Beyond the Argument, Where Science and Scripture Meet by Isang Nadali Teddy. I've talked about this for weeks now. It's a great article going through at a high level, talking about how faith and science come together and how they work together instead of competing. It's a great article. Support a great student working on this stuff and having these conversations. That'll be the second link down in the references section. It is very much worth a read of yourself. Make sure you go through and read that one. I think it's really easy for us to talk about these things on how God continues to provide and look at what the reward is and look at how God continues to fulfill these promises. And especially if you have been in the church for an extended period of time, these words start to glaze over us. We get so accustomed to them. We hear them time and time and time again that our eyes start to glaze over, and I feel like we start to lose the meaning of what this actually is. Yes, Abraham brought his son to be sacrificed, but we've heard the story time and time again, and so it's easy for us to overlook it. I think we need to take this out of the human experience for a moment here, because I think when we start looking at how so much of God's creation is doing the same thing, I think then it helps us reiterate what was kind of being discussed in the Romans text this week, that we should not be necessarily leaning into our own understanding, but we need to be reliant on God and be looking for places for us to be reliant on God, even if it means us going and taking a step out beyond where we are necessarily comfortable. As I stated at the intro, I'm in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm in a growing season right now. And one of the things that's really fun with it being a growing season is watching plants come alive. We've watched how they reshot up from the ground if they're an annual plant, and watching now as I even look out the window, seeing multiple different plants starting to bloom. But in order for that to happen, there's a lot of things that have to go right. It's not even just the moisture in the ground, which we'll get into a little bit, but it's also making sure that the right mixture of stuff is in the soil in order for this stuff to grow. And that's where we can get into talking about like the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, which are necessary for plants to survive. Take nitrogen, for instance. It is highly abundant in our atmosphere, but unfortunately, it's N2, which is triple bonded, thus making it extremely difficult for anything to be able to rip those nitrogen atoms apart. So what do we need? We need bacteria. And especially if you kind of heard of this before, legumes, the family of legumes, so like peas and things of that nature, a lot of your different beans or things of that nature, make this symbiotic relationship with bacteria. This specific bacteria is able to split the nitrogen and put it into a form that with water can be absorbed into the plant to allow them to grow. This is essential for plants' growth. And then as the plant grows and as it dies, there's the detritivores who are able to help break it down and thus release that nitrogen back into the atmosphere, allowing for N2 back into the atmosphere. There's this beautiful cycle. Phosphorus goes through a similar cycle of bringing it back to the earth to be able to be absorbed, to then be brought back as it dies and go through the cycle yet again. And there is an aspect of that where there is a lot of dependence and a lot of care and a lot of the plant trusting that things are going to happen. But I think there are even better stories out there. As I've talked about before, I live in Minnesota, part of the United States, and where I'm at, our state flower is the Showy lady slipper. It's a type of orchid. Now, orchids are weird in a lot of ways, and in a couple ways we're going to talk about a little bit further. First and foremost, they have a symbiotic relationship with a specific fungus. Because when an orchid goes to seed, unlike many other seeds, a lot of seeds have some type of food source to allow for the seed as it's being watered to start germinating, and it has some of its own nutrients built into the seed. Orchids don't work that way. Orchids are dependent on some other fungus being there to be able to feed nutrients into the seed to allow it to grow. The fungus is playing the long game with that orchid. It is then feeding all this energy into it to allow it to grow. And especially like the Showy lady slipper, like where I'm at, it can take upwards to 15 years before it blooms. But when that plant gets mature enough where it is able to start absorbing and taking in nutrients itself, the orchid remembers what that fungus has done and starts allowing that fungus out of its roots to absorb some of that nutrients as a thank you. It is giving back to that fungus, which is allowing it to then continue going and doing that for other orchids. But that's not the only way that orchids are very dependent on other things. Their whole pollination strategy is crazy. Now, we understand pollinators is another vital part of many plants, that there is some type of pollen, and we have bees or butterflies or other types of pollinators, moths, things that will come by, and as they are getting the sweet nectar that they're needing to be able to give them energy, they're rubbing off the pollen on them, and they're going to go to another flower, and thus it's going to be able to be spread that way. We see hummingbirds do that. We see all these other pollinators do that. And again, the Showy lady slipper being a part of this orchid family doesn't work that way. It does not have anything that is beneficial to the insects, to the bees, to whatever gets inside of its leaves. It's got this weird modified leaf that is very showy. So the Showy lady slipper, it has white petals with this kind of like cup where it kind of looks like a slipper that's kind of either a dark purple or a pinkish color, and it's kind of in a cup. And what it's doing with its fragrance and bright colors, it's attracting in these pollinators. They go in there and they find that there is nothing there for it. There's one way in, there's one way out. And so as that insect or pollinator is in there trying to figure out its way out, it's then rubbing and grabbing all of that pollen, and then it is banking on that insect or pollinator is going to go to another plant that is a lady slipper and do the same thing. That is how they spread their pollen. That is how they are able to help themselves reproduce. They are dependent on somebody getting caught in an intersection with one way out, and that they're going to go and do it again to none of their own benefit. But that is how the lady slipper survives. It is dependent on other insects, other pollinators doing the work for them, and that they're going to get nothing in return. The steadfast love that God has for us, I think in a lot of ways is that type of relationship. Yes, we get so much, but we cannot give back anything nearly to the gift of what it is that God is giving us. And I think a lot of times, especially being in a developed country, being in a stable position, there's a lot of times that I would rather lean on my own understanding, my own dependence, than necessarily tapping into God with things. I got it. I'll be okay. If Abraham had done that, Isaac wouldn't be here. Thus, the generations of faith wouldn't be here. But yet, Abraham trusted that God had something up, even to the point where he has his son tied up and is taking his knife out to kill his son. And that is when God says, I have something else. Trust me. You have shown your trust. Now here it is. Go and use it. There's a lot of ways when we look at like the Romans text on how leaning on our own understanding, leaning on our own understanding of how this works. Why didn't Abraham just bring one of his own sheep or rams or something to be slaughtered? Why not? He is quite wealthy. He has the ability. He has the means, but yet he doesn't. Because in that, what is he doing? He's doing what is being talked about here in Matthew 10. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. He's trusting and leaning into that understanding of God has told me this is the way that it needs to be done, and I'm going to trust that and lean into that and realize that I am still a guest to who God is wanting me to be. The prophet in Jeremiah talking about we're building upon the understanding of what God has continued to tell these prophets time and time and time again, that we continue to lean on what has been told to us and trusting that God's truth will continue to come out of it. How often do we end up leaning on our own understanding, our own abilities, our own methods? And yet when we look at things outside of the human experience, how so many different plants are dependent on different processes happening that are completely outside of their own control. They don't get a say in the weather. They don't get a say in when it rains. They don't get a say on whether or not they're near something that has all this nitrogen or not. They don't get a say in whether or not they're planted in a place where there is kind of like the networks to be able to share resources around. They don't get a say in so much of it. But if you think about it, trees continuing to grow, plants continuing to grow, it's a statement of faith that they're doing year after year after year after year, saying that God will provide. We just have to keep trusting. Some years are going to be bountiful. Some years are going to be harder than others, but we're going to continue to trust. That is a story I think that we need to recognize and utilize and dig into more. We need to be recognizing and seeing that within our own lives and recognizing that as that is happening, as we are trusting and leaning into that trust and ability and not necessarily having all the answers figured out, that in that, we then start seeing God more and more and more. And we start seeing what is being talked about in Matthew, that because we are leaning into that understanding, leaning into that relationship, that God's steadfast love and wanting to continue to be near us shows up. That is what we need to be looking at. That is what we need to be talking about. That is where we're starting to see this in nature time and time and again. We could talk about this for various different species. We could talk about it with migrations in general and how much it's not like they can call ahead to ask if there's been a drought somewhere, to make sure that there's resources for wherever they're going. They're not able to see weather reports, but yet there's the trust that we're just going to go. There's the trust of a plant of it's time to grow. I'm trusting that God's going to be there and to support me and be able to do that. And we'll see the just reward of doing that. We need to make sure that we're doing the same thing within our own lives. Are we doing that? That is a question for us this week is, are we leaning into God and trusting that God will provide? Are we leaning into God and trusting that God will provide? Now, there is a fine line here. There is a fine line of understanding that God will provide, but also the line of being unprepared and saying that God's just going to fill the gaps. That's not what God's saying. It's still going in, being prepared, being that everything is together and ready, and that God still does something above what you were expecting. And I think that's the type of faith that we should be striving for. That's the type of relationship that we should be striving for. That's what we're looking for. The faith like Abraham, the faith like we see with Jeremiah. We see what Paul is talking about, that yes, there's times we fall short, but then we continue to strive for where God is steering us because we hear of the reward, we know of the reward that is coming. And thus, then we get into the singing and the dancing, and we see the beauty of what God has done around us consistently. That's what's exciting. That's what's worthwhile. That's what we are going for. The Showy lady slipper is beautiful, and the amount of work and effort and dependence that it shows just to get to the first blossom is amazing. And I think it's something for us to be contemplating and thinking about and considering, because is our lives that way? Or are we still so dependent on ourselves that we don't recognize that there are others around us trying to help? We don't recognize that God is on the doorstep trying to give us the resources that we're needing, but we're so stubborn that we ignore it. We push it off. We say we know better. At what point do we recognize that sometimes God is trying to do something better for us by steering us in maybe a direction or a place where we're a little bit uneasy, uncomfortable, not feeling like we're fully prepared, that we've gotten things together for this, but you're telling me to go further and I don't feel good about going there. And I think that's where then God steps in. And that's, I think, where we start feeling that steadfast love. I think that's where we start recognizing the blessings of what God is doing. I know in my life there's definitely places where I need to be doing that. But I think it's one of these common realities that we really need to be working on and striving for consistently. Because when we can see that nature is doing this and trusting this consistently, we should be striving to do the same. Because we're not separate from it, we are a part of it. And if that is the culture of nature, then maybe we need to adopt that culture. Because I would argue, the more of that culture that we are seeing, the more of it is also the culture of what God has desired for us. So the question is are you ready to jump in, no matter how scary that may be? So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.